The meeting room on Nexus Station was large enough to hold 50 different species, and most days it did. The air was thick with the smell of different worlds, something sharpened, chemical from the chorus side of the room, something warm and sweet from the Valenti, and the faint hum of translation machines that never quite got human idioms right. It was a place of great power. It was also on most days a place where nothing truly important ever happened. Counselor Vreth of the Devaris sat in his tall chair near the head of the great circular table. He was old by most standards, merely 300 years, and he had spent most of those years in rooms exactly like this one. He had a long face, gray-blue skin, and eyes that had seen too many debates to be surprised by anything anymore. He tapped his fingers slowly on the arm of his chair as the current speaker, a small representative from the Talvi people, finished talking about trade routes near the outer rim. At the far end of the table, almost hidden behind the bulk of a Korath military delegate, sat the human representative. Her name was Ambassador Lena Marsh. She was a short woman with dark hair pulled back tightly, and she wore the simple gray uniform that the human delegation always wore. No decorations, no symbols of rank, just gray cloth and quiet eyes. She had been speaking less and less in recent sessions. Vreth clears throat and snorts had noticed, but he had not thought much of it. Humans were, in the polite language of conquered diplomacy, a minor species. They had arrived on the galactic stage roughly 80 years ago, fast by some measures, painfully slow by others. They were biological oddities, soft bodies, short lives, prone to extreme emotion. They got sick, they cried at funerals, they named their ships after dead people and lost places. The older species found them interesting, the way one finds a strange insect interesting, worth a moment of attention, not much more. The session moved on. Someone brought up the contested zones near the edge of the Devari sphere of influence. Vreth straightened slightly in his chair. This was the part of the meeting he had been waiting for. 3 months ago, a distress signal had come from a small human colony called Ilara's Rest. It sat inside one of those contested zones, a patch of space that 3 different species had quiet and competing claims to. The signal had been desperate. It spoke of an attack. It asked for help. It gave coordinates. It listed names. The conquered had debated for 9 days. 9 long, careful, politically measured days. In the end, Vreth had stood up and made the argument that settled it. The zone was too sensitive. Any intervention could be read as a territorial move. The diplomatic cost was too high. Better to wait, better to watch, better to let the humans handle their own problems. The voted passed. 41 in favor of non-intervention, 6 against. The human delegation had sat in silence. During the vote, Ambassador Marsh had not said a word. She had simply looked at Vreth across the length of the table, and then she had looked down at her hands. 6 days after the vote, the signal from Ilara's Rest stopped. No final message, no distress call. Nothing, just silence where a colony of 2.3 million people had been. The conquered had filed it as a colonial incident, a tragedy, yes, a great loss. But these things happened in the contested zones. The record was sealed. The matter was closed. Life continued. That had been 3 years ago. Now Vreth listened as a Devari legal Aide read out the new trade proposals. He nodded at the right moments. He made small notes on his data pad. Beside him, a young Valanthi, communications officer named Sela, was doing the same, her forefingers moving quickly over her own screen. Sela was new to Nexus Station, barely 2 years in her post, and she still had the habit of looking at things too closely. Vreth found it mildly annoying. She leaned over to him now, very quietly, and said, "Counselor, I filed a report this morning. There's an anomalous reading in the corridor 7. Transit lane, something large came through. I can't classify the energy signature." Vreth did not look up from his notes. "How large?" "Very," she said, and moving on. "Direct heading for Nexus Station. Transit traffic is always heavy near the station. Log it and pass it to the sensor team." I did pass it to the sensor team. They said it was probably a cargo freighter running with a damaged transponder. "Then there is your answer." Sela was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The energy pattern doesn't match anything in our records, not any cargo freighter, not any military vessel, not any ship class from any member species." Vreth finally looked at her. She was young, with the pale silver skin of her people and the wide, careful eyes that the Valanthi used to watch everything at once. She looked genuinely troubled. "File a secondary report," he said. "Mark it for review at the end of the week." Sela hesitated, then she nodded and looked back at her screen. Vreth returned to his notes. The trade proposals were actually quite interesting. There was a new tariff arrangement near the inner systems that could benefit the Devari considerably if handled correctly. He spent the rest of the session thinking about that. After the meeting, as the delegates filed out in small chatting groups, Sela sat alone at the table for a few minutes. She pulled up the anomalous reading again on her screen. She looked at the shape of it, the way the energy moved, the way it bent light slightly around it, the way its mass reading kept shifting as if the ship itself did not want to be measured. She had never seen anything like it. She thought about the human delegation and the way Ambassador Marsh had stopped talking 3 years ago. She thought about the file she had once found by accident, the sealed colonial incident report with the words Alaras rest at the top. She had only read a few lines before her access was denied. She saved the anomaly reading under her personal files, flagged it with the highest concern marker she had access to, and then sat back and stared at the wall for a long moment. Somewhere out in the dark between stars, something was moving toward them. Sela did not know why, but she felt very strongly that when it arrived, no one in that room would be ready for it. She closed her screen, stood up, and walked out of the empty chamber. The file was marked routine. It would not stay that way. The news reached Earth on a Tuesday morning. It came quietly, the way the worst news always does, not in fire or noise, but in a short transmission, a few lines of text, and then a long and terrible silence from the direction of Alara's rest. There were no more signals after that. No voices, no name, just empty space, where a world had been. On Earth, in the offices of the United Human Fleet Command, the generals and admirals sat in their chairs and did not speak for a very long time. Outside the windows, the city went on as normal. People walked to work, children went to school. The sun came up over the mountains the same way it always had. None of them knew yet. Soon they would. Commander Yara silently heard the news. A small room in a military base on the far side of the moon. She was 38 years old with short dark hair and the kind of face that did not give much away. She was known as a careful officer. Precise, not the kind of person who acted before thinking. Her senior officers respected her. Her crew trusted her. She had spent 15 years building that reputation, one decision at a time. When the message came through, she read it once, then she read it again. Then she sat down in her chair and put her hands flat on the desk in front of her and looked at the wall. Her sister had lived on Alara's Rest. Her sister's husband there too. Children. A small house near a river, she had been told, with blue flowers in the front garden. Her sister had sent a picture once. Yara had saved it on her personal device. She had meant to visit. She had kept saying there was time. There was no more time now. She did not cry. She did not shout. She sat at the desk for a very long time, and then she stood up, straightened her uniform, and went back to work. This was, it turned out, what humans did with grief. The species of the Galactic Concord had studied humans for decades and had never fully understood this quality. The Davari held long mourning ceremonies that could last years. The Valanthi processed loss through communal song and shared memory rituals. The Korath honored their dead with battle, with noise and fury and the clash of weapons. Every species had a shape for grief, a structure, a container. Humans turned grief into something else. They picked it up, held it close, and then they went to work. In the weeks after Alara's Rest went silent, the human delegation at the Galactic Concord began to change in ways that were hard to describe. They were still polite, still present at sessions, still filed their paperwork and attended their meetings. But slowly, quietly, they began to pull back. Ambassadors were recalled for consultations and returned later than expected. Communication channels were answered more slowly. At the great table of the Concord, the human voices grew quieter and then almost disappeared entirely. No one made a formal protest. No one demanded justice in front of the full assembly. There were no angry speeches. There was just a slow and careful withdrawal, like water draining from a bowl. Counselor Vreth noticed it as he noticed most things. He mentioned it once to a colleague who said that the humans were probably adjusting their diplomatic priorities. Vreth agreed. He did not think about it again. He should have thought about it more. Beyond the orbit of Jupiter, in a region of space that appeared on civilian maps as empty and uninteresting, the human military had begun building something. The project had no public name. It did not appear on any budget report that outside eyes could find. The workers who were brought in signed documents that were very long and very serious, and they understood without being told directly that what they were doing was not to be discussed. Commander Yara Solon was assigned to the project 8 months after Alara's arrest. She had requested the posting herself. Her request had been reviewed by 7 different people before it was approved. She arrived by shuttle, and when the pilot brought them around the far side of the construction platform so she could see the full shape of what was being built, she sat forward in her seat without meaning to. The ship was enormous. That was the first thing. But size was not what held her attention. She had seen large ships before, haulers, colony vessels, Deep range exploration craft, this was different. This ship did not look like something built for carrying things from one place to another. It did not look like a tool. It looked, Yara thought, like a decision. The hull was dark, not painted dark, but made of a material that seemed to pull light inward rather than reflect it. The sensor arrays were built flush against the body of the ship, so there were no obvious protrusions, nothing to catch or scatter an enemy scan. The engines, 4 of them arranged in a configuration no conquered species would recognize, were already partially active, and the space around them shimmered slightly with contained energy. The crew called the ship the Answer. That was not its official designation. But official designations are chosen by committees, names are chosen by people. Yara spent 2 years aboard that ship. Before it was finished, she learned every corridor, she met every member of the crew, she understood what it could do, and more importantly, what it was meant to mean. It was not just a weapon. A weapon is a thing you use and put away. This ship was a statement, a message made of steel and dark hull plating and engines that could fold the distance between stars. On the day the ship was declared ready, there was no ceremony, no parade, no speech from a general in a decorated uniform, just a quiet notification that came through on Yara's screen while she was eating breakfast in the ship's small mess hall. She finished her coffee. She put the cup in the cleaning rack. She walked to the bridge. The crew was already at their stations. People who work on something for years develop a feeling for when it is complete. You can feel the weight of all that time sitting in the hall around you. Yara stood at the front of the bridge and looked out at the stars through the viewport. Jupiter was visible off the port side, its great bands of color turning slowly. In the dark, she thought about a house near a river, blue flowers in the front garden, a sister who had waited for a visit that never came. Navigation, she said. Ready, Commander, said the officer at the navigation console. Set course for the Concord Central Transit Hub, standard approach, let them see us coming. There was a brief silence, then from every station on the bridge came the quiet sound of controls being set. The Answer, which was not yet the name anyone outside those walls would ever know it by, turned away from Jupiter and began to move. In the galactic Concord, no one was watching, no one was paying attention to the edge of human space. There were more important things to discuss: trade proposals, territory disputes, the complicated business of a galaxy full of civilizations that had been dealing with each other for centuries. No one was watching the human corner of space. That was the last mistake they would make. It was Sela who saw it first. She was at her communications desk on the lower level of Nexus stations. Operations Center, a wide circular room, full of screens and low-voiced conversations when every proximity alert. She had went off at the same time. For a single moment she thought something had gone wrong with her equipment. Then she looked at the raw data and she understood that her equipment was working perfectly. Something had just dropped out of transit in the main approach corridor. She pulled up the sensor feed and leaned forward so quickly that she knocked over the small cup of warm liquid she kept beside her keyboard. The spill went unnoticed. Her eyes were fixed on the screen. The ship was enormous. That was the first thing the sensors gave her. A mass reading that came in wrong twice, before the system accepted it as real. But the size was not what caused Sellers' hands to go still on the controls. It was everything else. The whole material scattered the deep scans in patterns that did not match any known composition. The energy readings from the drive section were outside every classification in the database. When she ran a standard profile comparison, the tool used to identify any vessel from any member species, the result came back with a single word: unknown. She ran it again. Unknown. A third time. Unknown. Operation, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. I have an unclassified vessel in the primary approach corridor. Mass reading is significant. I cannot identify the hull type, engine, signature, or point of origin. The operations center went quiet. Not the polite quiet of people paying attention, the sharp, airless quiet of people who have just heard something that doesn't make sense. Within 6 minutes, Nexus Station's full sensor array was locked onto the ship. Within 10 minutes, the first alerts had gone out to the senior Concord leadership. Within 15, Counselor Vreth was walking quickly down the corridor toward the main observation deck, his long gray robes trailing behind him. A look on his face that he did not fully understand. Yet, he had been in a planning session for the upcoming mid-year trade summit. His aide had pulled him out without explanation, which was unusual enough on its own. When he stepped onto the observation deck and saw the gathered faces of a dozen other senior delegates, all staring out the wide viewport at the same point in space, he knew that whatever this was, it was not routine. He walked to the viewport and looked out. The ship sat in open space about 40,000 km from the station. At this distance, it should have looked small. Most ships did at this range. It did not look small. It looked like something that had decided to be visible and was doing so deliberately. The hull was so dark that it was easier to see the ship by the stars it blocked out than by any light it reflected. The shape was long and strange, with curves where human ships normally had hard edges, and a kind of stillness to it that was almost alive. No running lights, no standard approach markings, no transponder ping. Just the ship sitting there, patient as a stone. What is it? Vreth asked. We don't know, said the Korith military delegate, Admiral Thrask, who was standing to his right. Thrask was not a being who was easily unsettled. His species had been warriors for 10,000 years. His voice right now was carefully flat, in a way that told Vreth he was working to keep it that way. It does not match any ship class in our records. We have dispatched scout wings to take up positions, but they have not been given engagement orders. Has it made any move? None. It has not deviated from its current position since it came out of transit. Vreth looked at the dark shape against the stars. He had the strange and unpleasant feeling of being watched, which was, of course, impossible from this distance. Without confirmed sensor lock, still, the feeling was there. Down on the lower deck, the Valenfy science team was running probability models in the docking bays. 3 different species were quietly asking about personal evacuation routes. Tulvi ambassador had locked himself in his quarters and was composing a message to his home government. In the Korith section of the station, weapons were being uncovered from storage for the first time in 11 years. And then the transmission came. It arrived on every frequency at once, unencrypted with no security wrapper. It was not scrambled or coded. It was simply spoken, a human voice, female, with the particular kind of calm that sounds not like the absence of feeling, but like feeling that has been compressed into something very small and very dense. The voice said, "This is Commander Yara Selene of the Earth colonial vessel. Alara's Rest, we are not here to negotiate, we are here to be understood. You have 72 hours. That was the entire message. It repeated once and then it stopped. The observation deck was so quiet that Vreth could hear the distant hum of the station's air systems. He registered the name of the ship last. His mind had been processing the message itself, the tone of it, the words. But when the name reached him, he felt it like something cold placed against the back of his neck. Alara's Rest. He knew that name. He had filed that name away in a closed record 3 years ago. He had made a very careful, very considered, very sensible political argument that had ended in a vote of 41-6, and afterward he had moved on to other business because that was what you did. You moved on. The Concord was large and complicated, and there was always other business. He stood at the viewport and looked at the ship that bore the name of a dead colony, and for the first time in a very long career, Counselor Vreth could not find the right political framing. The name of that ship had removed every comfortable word from his vocabulary. Behind him, he could hear the noise of the Concord beginning to fracture. Raised voices, urgent footsteps, the sound of communication devices going off. All at once, the station was waking up in the way that stations wake up when something has changed irrevocably. Vreth did not turn around. He kept looking at the ship. 72 hours. He wondered, standing there, what exactly it was that they were meant to understand. The first 12 hours were chaos. Not the visible, crashing kind of chaos. Not fires or alarms or people running in corridors. Nexus Station was too old and too practiced for that kind of drama. The chaos was quieter, which in some ways made it worse. It lived in hushed emergency meetings, in the faces of delegates who could not quite hide what they were feeling, in the communications channels that were suddenly working very hard. Admiral Thrace of the Korath dispatched a battle wing, 12 vessels, fast, heavily armed, the pride of Korath deep space capability. They moved into position in a wide formation around the Alara's Rest. Engines hot, weapons charged but not yet aimed. It was the kind of move that said, "We are here and we are ready," without quite saying anything that could later be called a provocation. The Alara's Rest did not respond to the formation at all. It simply moved. Not away, not toward the Qatar ships. It moved through them, around them, between them in a way that should not have been possible at that size. It was like watching a very large animal move through a crowd of smaller ones, without touching a single one, except this animal was a warship heavier than anything in the Concord fleet, and it moved with a precision that turned the 12 Qatar vessels into nothing more than a mild inconvenience. In 40 seconds, the Alara's Rest had gone from inside the formation to outside it, and it had done so without ever increasing speed above a casual drift. The Qatar wing stood down. There was no official announcement. They Simply stopped being a threat because the demonstration had made it very clear what kind of threat they were actually dealing with. In the emergency session that followed, 11 different species all tried to talk at once. The Devari wanted a formal protest lodged. The Talvi wanted evacuation corridors designated. The Valenti science team wanted more time to study the hull readings. The smaller species near the back of the room wanted very much to not be in the room at all. Counselor Vreth sat through all of it and said almost nothing. He had been in rooms like this many times before. He had always been the one with the steadying voice, the long view, the carefully reasoned argument that cut through the noise. Right now, he did not have a steady voice or a long view. He had the name of a ship written on the inside of his thoughts, and it would not leave. It was Sela who changed things. She came to Vreth during a break between sessions in the narrow corridor outside the assembly chamber. She looked tired. She had not left her station in over 20 hours, but her eyes were clear and direct in the way that young people's eyes sometimes are when they have decided to stop being careful. I want to open a communication channel to the Allura's rest, she said, not an official channel, a personal one. I filed the original anomaly report. I think they know that. I think someone on that ship is waiting to be contacted by someone who was paying attention. Vreth looked at her for a long moment. You are a junior communications officer, he said. Yes, she said, I know. He thought about it, then he said, I will not stop you. Sela opened the channel from her personal station at 300 station time, when most of the conquered delegates were in their quarters and the operation center was running on a reduced crew. She sent a simple text message. No voice, no formalities. I was the one who filed the first alert. I read part of the Allura's rest incident report before my access was cut. I am sorry I did not do more. Can we talk? The reply came in 4 minutes. Yes. What followed was a conversation that Sela would remember for the rest of her life, though she never spoke of it in detail to anyone except Vreth. Commander Yara Selini's voice came through her earpiece quietly, without drama, without anger. It was the voice of someone who had spent a long time deciding exactly what to say. She told Sela about her sister. She did not linger on it. She said the name once, and the names of the children, and then she moved on. She told Sela about the 9 days of debate, about the vote, about the silence that came after. She said that humans understood, perhaps better than most species, that the universe did not owe them anything. That loss was part of living, that sometimes terrible things happened and no one was to blame. But this was different, Yara said. We asked for help. We sent names, and the conquered looked at those names and decided that the political cost of caring was too high. That is not a tragedy, that is a choice. And we needed you to understand what that choice made you. Sela did not have an answer for that. She sat in the quiet of the operations center and listened. We are not here to start a war, Yara continued. If we wanted a war, you would know it by now. We are here because 2.3 million people deserved better, and no one said so loudly enough while they were still alive. Someone has to say it now. Someone has to make sure the conquered cannot forget it as easily as it forgot them. What do you want? Sela asked. We'll tell The counselors when they're ready to. Listen, Yara said. Are any of them ready? To listen. Sela thought about Vreth standing at the viewport with that look on his face. One of them might be, she said. There was a pause, then tell him to come. No security, no delegation, just him. Vreth went alone in a small shuttle. At 700 the next morning, he sat across from a screen on which Commander Yara Salini's face appeared. Older than he had expected, with dark eyes and a stillness that reminded him uncomfortably of the ship itself. She did not greet him. She pressed a button on her side and his screen filled with a file. He recognized it immediately. The Alara's rest distress signal. Every hour of it. I am not going to play all of it for you right now, Yara said. But I am going to play for every member of the Concord, all 47 delegations in full in session, so that every voice is heard by the people who chose not to listen to them. Vreth sat very still. After that, she said, we will talk about what comes next. He looked at her face on the screen. He thought about the vote, 41-6. He had stood up and made the argument himself. All right, he said very quietly. Listening session lasted 4 hours and 23 minutes. That was how long the full distress signal from Alara's rest ran. From the first automated emergency broadcast that had gone out when the attack began, all the way to the last fragmented voice transmissions that came in the final hours before the signal died completely. 4 hours and 23 minutes of voices, names, children crying, someone trying to keep calm long enough to give coordinates, someone else saying goodbye to a family member who was not there to hear it. Commander Yara Solon had made one demand before the session began, passed through Sela to Counselor Vreth, who had brought it to the full assembly, with the face of a man carrying something very heavy. Every delegate was to remain in their seat for the duration, no leaving, no breaks, no side conversations. There had been objections. Several of the older species had spoken of dignity and protocol and the proper procedures for conducting Concord business. Vreth had listened to each objection, turn, and then he had said very quietly that if they could not give 4 hours to the voices of 2.3 million dead people, then there was something deeply wrong with what the Concord had become. The objection stopped. The chamber where the Galactic Concord held its sessions was designed for large numbers and long speeches. It had tall ceilings and curved walls and excellent acoustics. Every word of the distress signal filled that chamber completely when a child's voice came through, small, frightened, asking where her mother was. The sound of it reached every corner of the room and left nothing untouched. Some delegates wept, not all of them. Different species processed emotion differently, but many did in their own ways. The Volant put their hands over their eyes in the gesture that meant profound sorrow in their culture. The Devari, who did not cry, sat with their heads bowed in a posture that their species reserved for the death of leaders, even Admiral Thrawn, the Corellian military delegate who had dispatched a battle wing 2 days ago, sat motionless and staring at the floor. When it ended, no one spoke for a long time. Then Yara Salini's voice came through the chamber speakers. She had been patched in directly from the Alara's rest. She spoke for 11 minutes. She did not shout, she did not accuse. She laid out in plain language what had happened and what she was asking for. The Alara provision, she called it. Binding conquered law, not a guideline. Not a recommendation, but a law that no distress signal from any inhabited world or settlement in any zone, contested or otherwise, could be delayed, tabled, or dismissed without a mandatory response. Within 48 hours, the response did not have to be military. It could be medical, it could be diplomatic, it could be as simple as a vessel sent to observe and report. But it had to happen every time without exception. No political cost could be cited as justification for doing nothing when people were calling for help. We are not asking you to be heroes, Yara said. We are asking you to be present, that is all. When someone calls out across the dark, you answer. That is the minimum. That is what civilized species do. The debate that followed lasted 3 days. Some species signed immediately. The Valente were first. Sela watched from her communication station as her species senior delegate put his mark on the document without discussion, without conditions, and then sat back with the quiet expression of someone who had been waiting a long time to do the right thing. Several of the smaller species followed. They had always been nervous about the contested zones. They understood better than the larger powers what it felt like to send a signal and wonder if anyone was listening. The Korath took longer. Admiral Thras spent a full day in private consultation with his home government before returning to the session and placing his mark on the document. He did not explain his decision. He had been in that room for 4 hours and 23 minutes. The Devarsi were last. Vret sat with the document in front of him for most of the 3rd day. He read it many times. He thought about the argument he had made 3 years ago, the careful reasoning, the political logic, the way he had laid out the costs, and concluded that non-intervention was the sensible choice. He had been right in purely procedural terms. He still believed the argument was sound. As arguments went, that was, he understood now, exactly the problem. A sound argument had ended in 2.3 million dead people and 4 hours of voices in a room that should have heard them 3 years sooner. Sela came to find him at the end of the day. She sat down across from him without being asked and looked at the document on the desk between them. Should I resign? He asked her. She thought about it seriously, which he appreciated. She was not the kind of person who gave easy answers. The humans didn't come here to collect guilt, she said at last. Commander Solon said it herself. They came so it doesn't happen again. What happens next matters more than what happened before. You know how to make things happen in the conquered. The question is what you do with that. Vreth looked at the document, then he picked up his signing tool and he put his mark on it. The Alara provision passed unanimously. On the morning of the 4th day, 47 signatures, no abstentions. The Alara's rest remained docked at Nexus Station until the last signature was confirmed. It had not moved since its arrival. It had not needed to. Its presence alone had been enough, a reminder large and dark and patient of what happened when the galaxy chose convenience over conscience. When the confirmation came through, Sela sent a short message to the ship. It passed all 47. Yara's reply came back within a minute. Logged, then after a pause, thank you for answering. Sela sat for a moment with that message on her screen. Then she sent back, I should have done it sooner. The reply took a little longer this time. When it came, it said simply, "Yes, but you did." The Alara Rest undocked 2 hours later. Quietly, without announcement. It moved away from Nexus Station on a heading that Sela recognized from the old colonial records. The coordinates of Alara's Rest, the place where the colony had been. On the bridge, Commander Yaroslav stood at the viewport and watched the station grow smaller behind them. The stars ahead were cold and very old, indifferent to what had happened and what had been decided. They had seen species rise and fall and rise again. They had seen great cruelties and small kindnesses and everything in between. Yara thought about blue flowers in a front garden. She thought about the 2 children she had never met. She thought about the sister who had believed, as most people believe when they are alive and well, and the future seems open, that there would always be more time. The ship moved forward into the dark. Years later, a Volante historian writing about this period would note that the humans had arrived at Nexus Station without an army, without an ultimatum, without a single weapon fired in anger. They had brought one ship, they had broadcast one message, they had played one recording. What they had actually brought, that historian wrote, was a name, and somehow that had been worse than any weapon, and somehow that had been exactly enough. The Alara provision has not been violated once in the years since its passing. No one who was in that chamber on those 4 days has ever suggested that it should be.